All right, welcome everyone to the very first episode of, horror stories read live by Mike Davis on Tuesday nights. So this is episode one. If you are watching live, as opposed to watching the archived version later, please let me know that you can see me and hear me. Really need that before I get going on reading, start reading the story. Anyway, welcome. If you're new to this, thank you, Alan. If you're new to this or me or the Lovecraft eZine podcast, we do a podcast on Sundays at 6 p.m. I've done that for years. That's live. And we talk about horror and we interview horror writers and creatives and so forth. Hi, guys. And then in the past couple of months, I've been doing Late Night with Lovecraft eZine on Thursday nights at when do I do that? 11 p.m. Eastern, don't I, Alan? Do I have that right? Yes, I believe that's right. So all you really have to remember is to go to the Lovecraft eZine YouTube channel, and anything coming up live will be at the very top there. And now we're adding Tuesday nights because you guys were interested in this. So I'll just think of this as Thursday nights originally. That I'll just think of this as an experiment. If you guys like this and people are showing up to listen to it live, then I will keep doing it. So, and if not, that's fine too. So it's an experiment. But be that as it may, horror stories live episode one. Now, I am going to keep it a surprise every time I read a story. So you won't know until Tuesday night when I come on to read it. The the here's the thing about why do a live reading. Because the name of this story is called The Night Wire, and it's a fitting story, as you'll see if you haven't read it. The Night Wire by H.F. Arnold, published in 1926. It's pretty fitting, but for an episode one of live readings of horror stories. That said, you could go on YouTube or Spotify, I imagine, and listen to any number of recordings of the Night Wire. That's not really the point. The point is, I mean, if you're watching this later and you're enjoying it, that's great. I really mean that. But there's something about live. We talk about this on Thursday nights. There's something about doing it live where people are watching at the exact same time as you are. It just there's this feeling of community and also this feeling of we're all sitting around the virtual campfire, right? And one of us is telling a story. And so I would say don't look back behind you too far into the dark because you don't know what you're going to see. Now, I thought we'd do a sort of mini discussion after the story. Alan, I think that was your suggestion. I'm not sure, but it's a good idea. But I want to give you a little context um, on this before I start. Again, the story is called The Night Wire, and I did not have this pulled up like I should have. Anyway, let's do a quick search. Give me a second. Search for The Night Wire in my notes. Now, the thing is, this story was published in 1926, and we're in 2024 at the moment. Um, yes, that sounds fine, Alan. That sounds fine. We'll just sort of feel our way into this. And it's important to kind of understand the context before I read the story. And I had my AI do some research, and I'm going to read what it spit out, which, by the way, to me, that's the proper use of an AI, among many other things. Not creating content, but maybe help you research something a little bit faster than you might have on your own. So let me read this, and then I'll read the story. In the 1920s, the United States experienced a significant transformation in its media landscape, and one of the key components of this change was the advent of night wires. Night wires were a crucial part of the news distribution system, particularly for newspapers. You know, you think back to 100 years ago, and there was no internet, there was not even TV or, I believe, radio yet. So this was pretty important. Night wires were very important to keep so that newspapers could keep up to the minute um, news. Night wires referred to the telegraph lines that operated during the night to transmit news stories to newspapers across the country. These wires were used by wire services such as the Associated Press, the United Press International, to send, etc., to send breaking news and other important stories that had developed after the newspaper's daily editions had gone to press. This allowed newspapers to have the most up-to-date information for their morning editions. Role and importance, I'll skip over this stuff, but night wires ensured that newspapers could publish the latest news, which was critical in an era where radio and television were not yet dominant sources of information, or existed in the case of television. Late breaking stories. Large news organizations had dedicated nightwire rooms, okay, staffed by editors and telegraph operators who worked through the night. These rooms were often busy and noisy with the clatter of telegraph machines and typewriters filling the air as news came in from across the country and the world. I think that's most of the context that we need. I can maybe read more of it later if we need to, but that's that's what you need to understand. So it's written by an H.F. Arnold, and I'm going to read this from the edition that was published in The Weird, edited by the Vandermeers. By the way, if you don't have this, excuse my headphones there. If you don't have The Weird, you really should get a copy. They did a remarkable job, and it was up to date to the year that it was published. I don't remember when that was, but maybe, I don't know, a dozen years ago, something like that. So, and all of these stories are published in The Weird in chronological order. So this one's from 1926. I'll read the bio that they have on H.F. Arnold, and then I'll read some more after the story. H.F. Arnold, 1902 to 1963, was an American pulp era writer who wrote only 3 published stories. Despite this low output, The Nightwire, first published in Weird Tales, is considered the most popular story from the first golden age of that magazine. Lovecraft is said to have loved this story. The Nightwire is perhaps remarkable in still being able to chill the reader today, despite using elements that could have made the story feel dated. It is a perfect example of how the weird creates not just unease, but dislocation. Details about the writer's life are scarce without even confirmation that H.F. Arnold was his real name. Some have speculated that he must have been a journalist. I would agree with that. All right, New York. Here we go with The Nightwire by H.F. Arnold. I'm going to say it. Are you sitting comfortably? Then let's begin. New York, September 30, CP Flash. Ambassador Halliwell died here today. The end came suddenly as the ambassador was alone in his study. Telegraph. Nightwear, obviously. There is something ungodly about these nightwire jobs. You sit up here on the top floor of a skyscraper and listen in to the whispers of a civilization. New York, London, Calcutta, Bombay, Singapore. They're your next door neighbors after the street lights go dim and the world has gone to sleep. Alone in the quiet hours between 2 and 4, the receiving operators doze over their sounders and the news comes in. Fires and disasters and suicides. Murders, crowds, catastrophes. Sometimes an earthquake with a casualty list as long as your arm. The Nightwire man takes it down almost in his sleep, picking it off on his typewriter with one finger. Once in a long time, you prick up your ears and listen. You've heard of someone you knew in Singapore, Halifax, or Paris long ago. Maybe they've been promoted, but more probably they've been murdered or drowned. Perhaps they just decided to quit and took some bizarre way out, made it interesting enough to get in the news. But that doesn't happen often. Most of the time you sit and doze and tap on your typewriter and wish you were home in bed. Sometimes, though, queer things happen. One did the other night, and I haven't gotten over it yet. I wish I could. You see, I handle the night manager's desk in a western seaport town. What the name is doesn't matter. There is, or rather was, only one night operator on my staff, a fellow named John Morgan, about 40 years of age, I should say, and a sober, hard-working sort. He was one of the best operators I ever knew, what is known as a double man. That means he could handle two instruments at once and type the stories on different typewriters at the same time. He was one of the three men I ever knew who could do it consistently, hour after hour, and never make a mistake. Generally, we use only one wire at night, but sometimes when it was late and the news was coming fast, the Chicago and Denver stations would open a second wire, and then Morgan would do his stuff. He was a wizard, a mechanical automatic wizard who functioned marvelously, but was without imagination. On the night of the 16th, he complained of feeling tired. It was the first and last time I had ever heard him say a word about himself, and I had known him for 3 years. It was just 3 o'clock a.m., and we were running only one wire. I was nodding over reports at my desk and not paying much attention to him when he spoke. "Jim," he said, "does it feel close in here to you?" "Why, no, John," I answered, "but I'll open a window if you like." "Never mind," he said, "I reckon I'm just a little tired." That was all that was said, and I went on working. Every 10 minutes or so, I would walk over and take a pile of copy that had stacked up neatly beside the typewriter as the messages were printed out in triplicate. It must have been 20 minutes after he spoke that I noticed he had opened up the other wire and was using both typewriters. I thought it was a little unusual, as there was nothing very hot coming in. On my next trip, I picked up the copy from both machines and took it back to my desk to sort out the duplicates. The first wire was running out the usual sort of stuff, and I just looked it over hurriedly. Then I turned to the second pile of copy. I remembered it particularly because the story was from a town I had never heard of, Exabico. Here is the dispatch. I saved a duplicate of it from our files. Exabico, September 6, CP Bulletin. The heaviest mist in the history of the city settled over the town at 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon. All traffic is stopped, and the mist hangs like a pall over everything. Lights of ordinary intensity fail to pierce the fog, which is constantly growing heavier. Scientists here are unable to agree as to the cause, and the local weather bureau states that the like has never occurred before in the history of the city. At 7 p.m. last night, municipal authorities, there's more. That was all there was. Nothing out of the ordinary at a bureau headquarters, but as I say, I noticed the story because of the name of the town. It must have been 15 minutes later that I went over for another batch of copy. Morgan was slumped down in his chair and had switched his green electric light shade so that the gleam missed his eyes and hit only the top of the two typewriters. Only the usual stuff was in the right-hand pile, but the left-hand bunch carried another story from Exhibico. All press dispatches come in takes, meaning that parts of many stories are strung along together, perhaps with but a few paragraphs of each coming in through at a time. This second story was marked Add Fog. Here is the copy. At 7 p.m., the fog had increased noticeably. All lights were now invisible, and the town was shrouded in pitch darkness. As a peculiarity of the phenomenon, the fog is accompanied by a sickly odor, comparable to nothing yet experienced here. Below that, in customary press fashion, was the hour 3:27 and the initials of the operator JM. There was only one other story in the pile from the second wire. Here it is. Second, add Exhibico fog. Accounts as to the origin of the mist differ greatly. Among the most unusual is that the sexton of the local church, who groped his way to headquarters in a hysterical condition and declared that the fog originated in the village churchyard. It was first visible as a soft gray blanket clinging to the earth above the graves, he stated. Then it began to rise higher and higher. A subterranean breeze seemed to blow it in billows, which split up and then joined together again. Fog phantoms, writhing in anguish, twisted the mist into queer forms and figures. And then, in the very thick mist of the mass, something moved. Well, I turned and I ran from the accursed spot. Behind me, I heard screams coming from the houses bordering on the graveyard. Although the sexton's story is generally discredited, a party has left to investigate. Immediately after telling his story, the sexton collapsed and is now in a local hospital unconscious. Queer story, wasn't it? Not that we aren't used to it, for a lot of unusual stories come in over the wire. But for some reason or other, perhaps because it was so quiet that night, the report of the fog made a great impression on me. It was almost with dread that I went over to the waiting piles of copy. Morgan did not move, and the only sound in the room was the tap-tap of the sounders. It was ominous, nerve-wracking. There was another story from Ixiapico, that's town name right, in the pile of copy. I seized on it anxiously. New lead, Exhibico Fog CP. The rescue party went out at 11 p.m. to investigate a weird story of the origin of a fog which, since late yesterday, has shrouded the city in darkness, has failed to return. Another and larger party has been dispatched. Meanwhile, the fog has, if possible, grown deeper and heavier. It seeps through the cracks in the doors and fills the atmosphere with a depressing odor of decay. It is oppressive, terrifying, bearing with it a subtle impression of things long dead. Residents of the city have left their homes and gathered in the local church, where the priests are holding services of prayer. The scene is beyond description, grown folk and children alike terrified, and many are almost beside themselves with fear. Amid the wisps of vapor which partly veil the church auditorium, an old priest is praying for the welfare of his flock. They alternately wail and cross themselves. From the outskirts of the city may be heard cries of unknown voices. They echo through the fog in queer, uncondensed minor keys. The sounds resemble nothing so much as wind whistling through a gigantic tunnel. But the night is calm, and there is no wind. The second rescue party, more. Well, I am a calm man, and never in a dozen years spent with the wires have been known to become excited, but despite myself, I rose from my chair and walked to the window. Could I be mistaken? Or far below in the canyons of the city beneath me, did I see a faint trace of fog? Pshaw, it was all imagination. In the press room, the click of the sounders seemed to have raised the tempo of their tune. Morgan alone had not stirred from his chair. His head sunk between his shoulders, he tapped the dispatches out on the typewriters with one finger of each hand. He looked asleep, but no, endlessly, efficiently, the two machines rattled off line after line, as relentlessly and effortlessly as death itself. There was something about the monotonous movement of the typewriter keys that fascinated me. I walked over and stood behind his chair, reading over his shoulder as the type as it came into being, word by word. Ah, here was another. Flash, Exabico CP. There will be no more bulletins from this office. The impossible has happened. No messages have come into this room for 20 minutes. We are cut off from the outside and even the streets below us. I will stay with the wire until the end. It is the end, indeed. Since 4 p.m. yesterday, the fog has hung over the city. Following reports from the sexton of the local church, 2 rescue parties were sent out to investigate conditions on the outskirts of the city. Neither party has ever returned, nor was any word received from them. It is quite certain now that they will never return. From my instrument, I can gaze down on the city beneath me. From the position of this room on the 13th floor, nearly the entire city can be seen. Now I can see only a thick blanket of blackness where customarily are lights and life. I fear greatly that the wailing cries heard constantly from the outskirts of the city are the death cries of the inhabitants. They are constantly increasing in volume and are approaching the center of the city. The fog yet hangs over everything, if possible. It is even heavier than before. But the conditions have changed. Instead of an opaque, impenetrable wall of odorous vapor, there now swirls and writhes a shapeless mass in contortions of almost human agony. Now and again the mass parts, and I catch a brief glimpse of the streets below. People are running to and fro, screaming in despair. A vast bedlam of sound flies up to my window, and above all is the immense whistling of unseen and unfelt winds. The fog has again swept over the city, and the whistling is coming closer and closer. It is now directly beneath me. God, an instant ago the mist opened, and I caught a glimpse of the streets below. The fog is not simply vapor, it lives. By the side of each moaning and weeping figure, by the side of each moaning and weeping human, is a companion figure, an aura of strange and vari-colored hues. How the shapes cling, each to a living thing. The men and the women are down, flat on their faces. The fog figures caress them lovingly. They are kneeling beside them. But I dare not tell it. The prone and writhing bodies have been stripped of their clothing. They are being consumed, piecemeal. A merciful wall of hot, steamy vapor has swept over the whole scene. I can see no more. Beneath me, the wall of vapor is changing colors. It seems to be lighted by internal fires. No, no, it isn't. I've made a mistake. The colors are from above, reflections from the sky. Look up, the whole city is in flames. Colors as yet unseen by man or demon. The flames are moving, they have started to intermix. The colors are rearranging themselves. They are so brilliant that my eyes burn, yet they are a long way off. Now they have begun to swirl, to circle in and out, twisting in intricate designs and patterns. The lights are racing each with each, a kaleidoscope of unearthly brilliance. I have made a discovery. There is nothing harmful in the lights. They radiate force and friendliness, almost cheeriness. But by their very strength they hurt. As I look, they are swinging closer and closer, a million miles at each jump. Millions of miles with the speed of light? Aye, it is light, the quintessence of all light. Beneath it, the fog melts into a jeweled mist radiant, rainbow-colored of 1,000 varied spectra. I can see the streets. Why, they are filled with people. The lights are coming closer. They are all around me. I am enveloped. I. The message stopped abruptly. The wire to Exabico was dead. Beneath my eyes, in the narrow circle of light, from under the green lampshade, the black printing no longer spun itself letter by letter across the page. The room seemed filled with a solemn quiet, a silence vaguely impressive, powerful. Hale looked down at Morgan. His hands had dropped nervelessly at his sides, while his body had hunched over peculiarly. I turned the lampshade back, throwing the light squarely in his face. His eyes were staring, fixed. Filled with a sudden foreboding, I stepped beside him and called Chicago on the wire. After a second, the sounder clicked its answer. Why? But there was something wrong. Chicago was reporting that wire 2 had not been used throughout the evening. "Morgan," I shouted, "Morgan, wake up. It isn't true. Someone has been hoaxing us." Why, in my eagerness, I grasped him by the shoulder. His body was quite cold. Morgan had been dead for hours. Could it be that his sensitized brain and automatic fingers had continued to record impressions even after the end? I shall never know, for I shall never again handle the night shift. Search in a world atlas discloses no town of Exabico. Whatever it was that killed John Morgan will forever remain a mystery. The end. Well, you can see why Lovecraft really liked that story and probably informed, at least a little bit of what he wrote. The strange colors and so forth. First off, I'd like to ask you guys, has anyone read this story before? And either way, what are your thoughts on this particular story? I think that a story like this, it being narrated, adds an extra dimension. Of course, if I was being paid to narrate it or was narrating it for the channel not live, then every time I needed to take a drink, there I would have paused the recording, or every time I stumbled over a name or a word, I would have deleted that and gone back. But live is live, right? So a couple things before I forget. First of all, this mist, this fog, of course, immediately makes me think of Stephen King's The Mist, of course, and also makes me think of one of my favorite horror movies, 1980's The Fog by John Carpenter. John Carpenter's The Fog in 1980 came out. Those immediately come to mind, and it would be interesting to know if Carpenter read this story back in the day. He's a Lovecraft fan, so I would imagine so, although it's been over 40 years since that movie came out. Um, Stephen King is widely read. I would imagine he's read this story at some point. Whether it inspired him to create The Mist is another story. Um, is another question, I should say. Um, what else do I have for you guys? Now, this author is a bit mysterious. We don't even know for sure if his name was H.F. Arnold. Um, my feeling, based on just a little bit of research, was that it was. I'm going to read a couple paragraphs from a website, some disturbances dot surlymedium.com. I'll have to link to this later in the show notes. Um, the sole work for which he's known, a 6-page long story called The Night Wire, is still being anthologized almost 90 years after its appearance in Weird Tales magazine. Most recently, it was included in the Big Book of Ghost Stories. So, the editor is Otto Penzler, the proprietor of New York City's renowned Mysterious Bookshop, and a truly outstanding anthologist. Penzler's editorial note preceding the story is perhaps the best source of information about Arnold, who left remarkably few traces of himself behind. A web search adds a few facts, but not many. His full name was Henry Ferris Arnold. He was born in 1901 or 1902. He died in 63. He might have been from Illinois. He moved to Hollywood to be a press agent sometime during the 20s. He was likely a newspaperman at some point. More on this in a moment. He published 3 stories in his lifetime. The other 2 are called The City of Iron Cubes, 1929, and When Atlas Was, appeared in Amazing Stories in 1937. And that's pretty much all we know. Uh, but it it's a powerful story, and if you leave one story behind, you know, it says something that it's 100 years later, and we're still talking about this story, and we're still enjoying and being moved by this story. Um, this person goes on to write that his writing is lean, unlike the purple prose that was so typical of weird tales in the 1920s. The wire service office where his story is set is concisely drawn. It could have come from any of the hard-boiled crime stories that appeared in Black Mask magazine during the same period. Otto Penzler wrote that Arnold might have worked in such an office. I believe it. This story is filled with small details that seem to come from first-hand experience, such as the reference to double men who could transcribe the feeds coming across 2 telegraph lines at the same time. I'm sure we could have an even longer conversation with Pete and the rest of the eZine panelist gang about, comparing this story and contrasting this story with the modern era. I mean, it starts off there is something ungodly about these Nightwire jobs. You sit up here on the top floor of a skyscraper and listen in on to the whispers of a civilization. New York, London, etc. They're your next door neighbors after the streetlights go dim and the world has gone to sleep. Makes me think of listening to news or talk radio in the middle of the night. Makes me think of, I don't know, uh, in some cases, uh, live news from the middle of the night, chat rooms, etc. Chris, you'll be able to rewind after I go offline here. So no worries, buddy. Alan says it sounds like it could have been the prologue for a novel or the opening for a movie. Very effective, even at just 6 pages. Yeah, very, very effective. I'm not sure what else there is to say, except I want to read a few comments from Goodreads about this story. Um, the it the ending is ambiguous, which I like, of course, when it's done right. This person at Goodreads says her name's Martha, and she says the question is where Morgan got the story from. Maybe the dying synapses of his brain caught a glimpse of some apocalyptic future where the ghosts of the dead rise up to prey on the living and the world ends with the sky in flames. Or if we'd like to take an idea from Howard or Lovecraft, maybe this happened long ago in prehistory to a town that was wiped out by the disaster. I don't think I buy that since we've got a person on the wire talking about it. Someone else, Kathy says, I think the town exists, but not in this dimension. He's plugged into a news feed from elsewhere. But of course, what makes it creepy is that we don't know the answer. The event is just there, irrational and eerie. I hate it when horror writers over-explain, and this story certainly avoids that. Now, if you ask writers, editors, creative people, people like me who talk about weird fiction, have edited weird fiction, what exactly is weird fiction? Um, well, you'll get if you ask a dozen people, you'll probably get a dozen different answers. But I do think that one aspect of weird fiction is basically saying, okay, this extremely strange thing happened, and that's all I know. I don't have the answer of what happened or where it came from or what it means. That could be one definition of some weird fiction, in my view. Thomas Ligotti, in an introduction to one of his collections, references the story, and I'm just going by memory here. The two-line story, uh, the last man on Earth reached in the dark to get his glasses, his eyeglasses. The eyeglasses are placed in his hand. So there, in two sentences, we have a weird fiction story, according to Ligotti, who I would think is knows what he's talking about, and I agree with him. So it says this weird thing happened, and I don't understand it, and I don't have the answer to it. Darren, I have read the whole anthology, The Weird, and you know it's time for me to start over and read it again, I think. But a lot of the time, in the years that I've had it, I'll pick a story and read it. There's nothing wrong with reading an anthology like that this way as well. And maybe the Vandermeers could. I hope they do another Weird at some point. Maybe pull more stories from the past, and then modern stories that were not yet published when they published the Weird. So that'd be great. Um, but yeah, like Soren Narnia, I told him the story once, and I've told it too many times on the podcast of when my wife and I were traveling from a wedding, and we were on this, lonely two-lane road, and the thing that happened to us, or rather the thing that we saw that we can't explain, and that's it. We saw something strange. We both agreed as to what it looked like, so it wasn't our imaginations, but we don't know what it was. I don't have a frame of reference for it. If you guys want me to tell it again, let me know, but I think most of you have heard it. I'm not sure. So I don't know. You guys agree? Weird fiction could one explanation of what weird fiction is could be, um, this happened. It's strange. It's weird, and I don't understand it, and I probably will never understand it. Cue the fiction of Paul Tremblay. Uh, by the way, I told Paul today that if he didn't already know, his new novel horror movie was is number one in the United States in horror fiction. So congratulations to Paul. I will further add that if you like weird fiction, um, my favorite story, and I like all of Paul's books, I do. My favorite story of Paul's is Disappearance at Devil's Rock. If you haven't read that one, definitely pick it up. It's my favorite of his yet, and I immensely enjoyed Horror Story. So someone else says this is probably one of my favorite unfairly obscure horror stories. Um, yeah. So, paperknife.wordpress.com, the last couple of paragraphs talking about this story, you begin to realize just how intricately constructed this story really is, yet how compressed that detail is, as it should be, because economy of words is the telegraphy name, which makes the lengths of the reports from Exepico, who the hell knows if I'm saying that right, all the more remarkable and indicates how dire the situation is. Indeed, the more you look at the story, the weirder it gets. The narrator attempts to remain aloof, but there's a wonderful little moment when he walks to the window. Could I be mistaken, or far down in the canyons of the city beneath me did I see a faint trace of fog? I think, too, the story taps into the idea of the mystery of telegraphy, of messages emerging from the ether. Who knows what wires were crossed in this instant? But the result is a remarkably compelling story, as though the fog might at any moment seep out of the wires into the office or off of the page. And here's something I don't remember reading. It says, this story also reminds me a little of Rudyard Kipling's Wireless, perhaps because of the underlying theme of inexplicable messages. One of Kipling's lesser known stories, but well worth reading. I guess I'll have to look at that. If I read it, I don't remember reading it. So anyway, guys, let me know if you would like me to continue doing this. You can comment in the side chat, or if you're watching later, you can comment below, or you can email me, whatever you feel most comfortable doing. Lovecraft eZine at gmail.com. Lovecraft EZINE at gmail.com. If you don't want me to keep doing it, I assume that you're not writing. So, let me know what you would like. I'm fine if if it's just a one-time experiment. But I hope you guys have enjoyed it. I certainly did. All right, thanks, Darren. I've got one vote. I will be the writer Ananda Lima, who her book Craft Stories I Wrote for the Devil is coming out tomorrow. We were supposed to have her on Sunday, but there was a mix up on both of our parts, I think, really. Just got our wires crossed um, on the time. And so I am interviewing her tomorrow. That's Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. So noon Central, 10 a.m. Pacific. And of course, that'll be live, or you can watch later, as always. And then, as we've been doing for the last 2 months, Thursday we'll have late night with Mike and Oreo at 11 p.m. Eastern. Thanks, guys. And Alan says, excellent reading. Please continue as often as you feel like it. Like the idea of lost public domain stories. Yeah, me too. Or, stories that have not gotten a lot of attention, or just, stories that grab me, I guess. If there's a public domain story that you'd like me to read in the future, um, email me. I will forget otherwise if it's in a comment. Sorry. Lovecraftezine at gmail.com. Email me and tell me about it, and we'll see if I can do that. Last but not least, and you don't have to spare my feelings, uh, I hope the reading was enjoyable as far as my voice and all that. Now, reading live, you're always going to get. It's never going to be perfect, and I'm going to stumble over the occasional word because it is live and I can't go back and correct it and record over it. But that said, um, the taking the occasional drink made for accidental dramatic pause, right? Anyway, thank you guys. Appreciate the kind words. Comment on the side or below if you'd like me to continue. Comment below if you're watching this later, or if you're shy, email me lovecrafteZine@gmail.com. And good night, and don't look too far away from the fire. Goodbye and hello, as always.